I want to start very quickly with an explanation of why Homeland Security is talking to you about intellectual property rights. If it's okay with you, I'm also going to walk around a little bit. I have to stay apparently within that camera's view and that camera's view, but I was a trial lawyer for a number of years, and quite frankly, I'm more used to moving around while I talk than standing behind a podium or at a table. I used to stand in front of 12 jurors and ask them to find people guilty, obviously. I won't ask you to find anyone guilty at the end of this, unless you really want to. But ultimately, I'll just move around a little bit. So Homeland Security was created in 2003, I think as most people know, after the attacks on the United States on 9/11. And Homeland Security Investigations is basically the culmination of the former U.S. Customs Service and the investigative side of the Immigration Service. So they took the police from these two entities and they put them into what's now called Homeland Security Investigations. So we retained all of the authorities that we had when we were the Customs Service, as well as, of course, the authorities of the Immigration Service. I'm not really going to talk about immigration today unless anyone really wants to talk about it. I'm happy to. But what I want to focus on, obviously, is the customs side. So intellectual property rights is historically a customs issue for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's revenue, which is what customs tend to really do. And secondly, obviously, there's contraband smuggling, which is the primary role of HSI, at least, Homeland Security Investigations, in looking at the problem of counterfeit goods and now pirated goods. I want to just tell you a little bit about ICE, HSI, and there's a whole bunch of acronyms, and I'll try to keep those to a minimum. But ultimately, we are authorized to have 7,200 federal agents. So those are 7,200 individuals with arrest authority who will arrest for, again, those customs violations and some immigration violations. We have another 5,000 individuals on sort of the immigration detention side. So the primary purpose of the 7,200 or so is going to be criminal violations. Ultimately, we have, of course, a lot of work to do. I'm going to find my little clicker. Just give me a second. We have a lot of work to do, which is just barely encompassed on what's on the slide. And that is everything that's contraband that comes into the United States or leaves the United States, we have to investigate. So of course, drug smuggling is a huge part of what we do, just as it is for any national police or customs service that is monitoring contraband smuggling. The money that comes from that, of course, is part of our remit. Then we have just odd sort of things like you see the painting on the right side. If somebody steals a painting in Europe, for instance, or a cultural artifact and brings it to the United States, we will seize it. We will return it to the country of origin. And we've actually been fortunate to do that here as well as in a lot of other European countries. You see the military hardware. We have a lot of countries that try to get military hardware out of the United States because they're banned from buying it. They would like to have it. We try to keep them, obviously, from getting it so that they don't attack our allies or especially us. Ultimately, you have a gang tattoo on the far left corner because a lot of gangs in the United States, as they are in Europe too, are transnational. When they cross our border, they commit a crime. And so we will arrest them and remove them from the country. Ultimately, war criminals that try to escape the jurisdiction of their own country and come to the United States, we will seize them, we will arrest them, and then return them, hopefully, for some justice in their own country. So there's this huge area of smuggling and, unfortunately, interdiction that we have to pay attention to, and we do. But I offer that to you because I also want to explain how IPR factors into that. But I also want to know a little bit about you. So let me just ask a few questions. Is there anyone from law enforcement here? Okay. Would you like to be in law enforcement? Okay. Okay. That's okay. I was a lawyer. It's all right. I'm a recovering lawyer. What about from customs? Is there anyone from the customs side? Policymakers? Students? Other lawyers? Anyone who will not admit it? No, just kidding. Anyone who just wandered in here by mistake and is wondering why they're listening to? Well, it's very helpful to understand a little bit, and what I want to do is explain now, obviously, what we do in IPR, because I know that's the focus of what we're talking about. Because it's inherently a transnational crime, usually counterfeit goods or pirated goods, we are unfortunately now seeing everything, and I will occasionally move up here, but this is what we tend to always think about when we're looking at the counterfeit goods. We start to think about, obviously, clothing, apparel, handbags, but we also have to start thinking about Colgate toothpaste. We did a case in New Jersey on the east coast of the United States about 5-10 years ago where we seized Colgate toothpaste, counterfeit toothpaste, that was being counterfeited with a component that you would find in antifreeze. I don't know how antifreeze translates very well, but it's what goes in the radiators of vehicles, of cars. This is the same chemical that we would use to cool the engine of a car was found in the counterfeit toothpaste. We obviously have medicines, fake medicines now that come in a bottle this size as opposed to the container loads of counterfeits that we used to see. And I won't go through every slide, but I think, or every photo here, but you'll start to see what we've seen as a shift in counterfeit goods. We were talking earlier about this in terms of where counterfeiters have gone. And I'll talk more about organized crime in a moment, but I want people to understand that, no mistake, counterfeiting is run primarily by organized crime. Whether we consider it the same organized crime as like the mafia in Italy and in the United States, or whether we consider it as an organized criminal network that actually has individuals who have different roles in there and different responsibilities and different levels of hierarchy, it is the same thing in counterfeit world where we have organized criminal networks. And there's been a shift of the organized criminal networks from the usual sort of luxury goods that we've seen in the past to now the medicines. Now this is a circuit breaker that caught on fire, to batteries. And I'll go through these a little bit more in a moment. But ultimately, that's made it more difficult for law enforcement agencies. It's made it a lot more difficult to protect the public from counterfeit goods. Nobody usually gets hurt if they wear a fake Lacoste shirt. But ultimately, obviously, with the medicines, with the toothpaste, with the circuit breakers that are going to catch on fire, it's our responsibility to protect the public from that. And that's what we're trying to do in our enforcement operations. When I talked about the 7,200 agents that we're authorized to have within our agency, about 6% of our time will be spent each year on intellectual property enforcement. Now, it's sometimes hard to understand that because we talk about what we do in terms of hours usually as a law enforcement agency. But ultimately what that will mean for us is that we will have 25,000 seizures roughly this year for intellectual property. Now, a seizure can be one item. It can also be a container full of items. Usually it's somewhere in between. But ultimately, we spend a significant amount of time on enforcing intellectual property rights, and I'll talk about why that is in just a moment. I do want to mention also, with regard to the smuggling and intellectual property, we also spend a fair amount of time on cigarette smuggling. Cigarette smuggling is inherently a revenue issue. And it is a health and safety issue, although it's always a little ironic talking about health and safety issues when you're talking about smoking in general. But I think counterfeit cigarettes are a revenue issue for a lot of countries, including in the EU. So between my agency, Homeland Security Investigations, and Customs and Border Protection, which are actually the guys who search the containers at the ports, we seized 85 million counterfeit cigarettes or illegal cigarettes last year. And ultimately, our goal is obviously to protect the revenue of the United States as well as the health and safety of individuals. We have a legal obligation. I'll talk about more of the statutes, the laws in a little bit, but I just want to start with the primary Constitution of the United States, which was, of course, 1789. I've been living in Europe, by the way, for 2 years, and I always feel a little odd when I talk about things being old in 1789. I think the hotel I stayed in last night is much older than that. The reality is that for us, this was, of course, the beginning of our democracy. And they put, the framers and the founders, as we call them in the United States, they put intellectual property in the Constitution. It was so important to them, and of course it was a principle that had been founded in England for almost a century before. It was so important that they wanted to have it in the Constitution. So we have a constitutional obligation in the United States to protect intellectual property. And ultimately, I think you'll see different interpretations of that clause in the Constitution, but it has been transformed into federal law in 2 ways. And I do want to get some terminology straight as well, because sometimes I find in Europe the terminology is a little bit different than we'll use in the United States. When I talk about counterfeit goods, I'm talking primarily about hard goods, the physical products, such as the counterfeit clothing or the fake medicines, or I'll show you some other pictures of hard goods in a little bit. When I talk about piracy, I'm really talking about digital content, so movies, films, music, software. There's some others in there, but ultimately that's a difference for us. And it's different in the way our laws are set up. We have a counterfeiting statute and we have a piracy statute. Both those statutes are criminal. There are some civil statutes as well, of course, but from our purposes, for our law enforcement agencies' purposes, we are dealing with criminal statutes. The legislature has determined that this is criminal activity. Now, you're going to hear from my colleague Edward Hand in a little bit, and I will tell you that as officials within Homeland Security investigation, we don't have a decision to make as to whether it's criminal or not. That decision was made by the legislature. We are the executive branch, and our job is to carry out the legislative branch determined laws. So that's what we do, and I'll of course go into that a little bit more. But ultimately, the 2 statutes that primarily we look at is the counterfeiting statute and the copyright statute, the trademark statute and the copyright statute. Both of those have fairly significant penalties. Both of those have generally up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. And I'll talk about some cases in a little bit where people are going to prison for violating both of those statutes. Ultimately, we are imposing punishment for those as we go forward. I just want to talk briefly, very briefly, especially for the lawyers in the room, this might be helpful to understand. We are, of course, a common law country in the United States. So the relationship between the prosecutors and the agents and the judges is a little bit different. We have an adversarial system where basically the law enforcement agency is charged with developing the evidence, taking it to the prosecutor who, even though we're in the executive branch together, I've been in a law enforcement agency and I've been a prosecutor previously. We are not always seeing eye to eye. Sometimes those 2 don't necessarily get along, but that's a check in the system, if you will, that's purposely devised so that the prosecutor can say to the law enforcement agency, that's not something that we're going to prosecute. I know you just spent a year of your life investigating this, but we're not going to prosecute it. Most often what you get, though, is because of that, because the law enforcement agency doesn't want to waste its time trying to actually investigate something that's not going to be prosecuted. Most of the time they'll go to the prosecutor early on in the investigation and say, this is what we're looking at, this is the evidence we've developed so far, what are you thinking about the possibility of prosecution? And if they get a traffic green light basically at that point, then they can work together to try to develop the evidence. So that's similar to the European system in some ways. But ultimately what will happen is they will obviously take that to a judge, and because this is criminal, everything is the highest standard, of course. To convict someone, you have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. To get search warrants in the United States, it's a probable cause standard, which is a fairly high standard. And of course, to get some other type of enforcement, you have to have reasonable articulable suspicion. That's the most I will go into the great details of the justice system, but I think it's important to understand how we function as a law enforcement agency within that system. Let me talk briefly about the IPR Center, because I mentioned that we have up to 7,200 agents, and we'll spend about 6% of our time actually looking at intellectual property violations. We can't handle all of the IPR violations in the United States. It's just not possible. We don't have enough resources, and we have, as I mentioned earlier on the second slide, we have other responsibilities. And it's very hard to say that all of those or any of those aren't as important as IPR. So about 5 years ago or so, we really started to invigorate the IPR Center. It's led by my agency, it's led by HSI, but it is a task force, if you will, of 21 agencies and or governments. 17 are US agencies, all federal agencies, which means that they're all at the US level, but they have some responsibility for IPR. So for instance, the State Department is a partner agency because the State Department, which runs, of course, our embassies around the world, the State Department has a great interest in ensuring that the intellectual property of American companies is protected. Also, we have the FBI, which is probably the best known federal law enforcement agency, US law enforcement agency in the world. The FBI is part of the IPR Center because they have an extreme interest, particularly in IPR violations that involve computer intrusion. Somebody hacking into a system, taking a trade secret, for instance, from a company, and then using that trade secret to capitalize on their own production. So that's an FBI issue, and the FBI also does some other public health and safety issues. We have, I won't read you every one of the little emblems on the bottom, but we have pretty much every agency that we would expect in the US has an interest. The scariest one that I heard just was the last partner to join, which was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is responsible for ensuring that nuclear power plants in the United States are run safely, that they are run obviously within regulations that are established for all power plants within the United States. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is now starting to see the infiltration of counterfeit products into nuclear power plants. So I'll show you a video in a moment of what can happen with a counterfeit good, and ultimately you can decide whether that's how a nuclear power plant should be run. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which only has about 5 criminal investigators in it, has realized that they need to join the IPR Center to add more personnel, if you will, to the investigation, because they cannot, they know they cannot on their own handle that mission. So the IPR Center has now developed, I think, very fully over the last 5 years. A lot of intensive effort went into it. And the reason I like to talk about it is because we tried it once about 10 years ago, and we didn't succeed. It was actually in 1999, so maybe almost 14 years ago now. We tried developing the IPR Center, then 9/11 occurred, we had to shift our focus. And so I talk about it because, while I try to mention that we do things really well in the United States, I want you to understand we've always done things with the intention of doing them well, but sometimes we don't succeed. Winston Churchill, who was half American, once said, "The Americans will always do the right thing after they've tried everything else first." And so ultimately, I think that's sometimes true, is that we want to succeed, we want to do the best we can, but we sometimes have little stumbling blocks. But now with the IPR Center, I think we're on the right track. We're developing programs there. My talk isn't on the IPR Center, so I won't focus at all on that. But we are developing programs there where even other agencies, other countries can come to the IPR Center and hopefully learn from us. There's a holiday, and I don't think it's as popular a holiday in Europe, but we have Halloween in the United States where all the kids will dress up and try to scare each other and ultimately get free candy. And what we just put out from the IPR Center was there are contact lenses that are colored. And contact lenses are colored because people want to change the color of their eyes for whatever reason. When they dress up in a costume, they in particular want to change the color of their eyes, usually to some sort of demon red or something like that. We're now seeing counterfeit contact lenses. And when those contact lenses, of course, get put in the eyes of children or adolescents or even adults, they are now starting to actually tear away parts of the eye because they're counterfeit. And so ultimately, we just put out an alert, I think 2 days ago, to the public saying, just be aware that you should not buy these from a non-reputable facility, basically. I started early on with talking about the clothing, and I think this is what the common perception is of IPR violations. And Dora, please forgive me that I have Nike on there, because it is relevant that these are being counterfeited. But generally, this is what people think about. This is what the general public thinks about. They think of a fake Rolex watch, or what we call a Folex watch. They think of course, Nike, which is one of the most counterfeited items in the world. They think of the fake Louis Vuitton purse. I don't know who put this on there, but I don't think anyone wants a counterfeit Office 97 anymore, but we'll eventually get that updated. And then we have Oakley sunglasses. The only reason Oakley sunglasses are on there is because they are the most popular sunglasses for law enforcement in the United States. If you get pulled over in the United States, I hope that doesn't happen. Feel free to mention Edward's name if you do. But if you get pulled over in the United States, the guy who comes up to your car, I guarantee he'll have Oakley sunglasses on. But so he's really mad when he finds out they're counterfeit, so we go after Oakley. So this is the primary perception of what people have. And I understand that because that's what was being sold and is still being sold on the streets. This is what people see when they actually get into markets where there are counterfeit goods sold. But now, I think as many of you probably know, this is the new world of counterfeiting. This is where those organized criminal networks have realized that there's more money to be made by counterfeiting a heart medication, setting up a website that looks, I would go to this doctor if I was sick. He looks very reputable. And ultimately, I want to buy generic Plavix because I'm a little bit upset that my real Plavix cost me $100 for a month's supply. So I will now buy it over the internet. This isn't one of them, but we have a lot of counterfeit pharmaceutical sites that claim they're based in Canada. If you're in the United States, and as you may know, we don't have a socialized healthcare system. Despite what you're hearing, we still don't have a socialized healthcare system. So healthcare is very expensive in the US. Medicines are very expensive in the US. Even if you have insurance, they can be very expensive. And so the Canadians do have a socialized healthcare system, as most countries do. And ultimately, you'll see these sites have Canadian flags on them so that Americans think, oh, well, it's a Canadian pharmaceutical company that can sell me this medicine at a reduced rate. That's why it's such a good deal, not that it's counterfeit. Now, I won't ask a personal question about how many people are on daily medications. I will tell you, I'm on a daily medication for cholesterol. I have high cholesterol, and so my doctor said, you need to have a daily medication. I take that medication, I buy it through, I hope, a reputable online pharmacy through my insurance company. But unfortunately, there are many people who are going to this alternative to reduce their costs. And Plavix is a medication that if you take a counterfeit, you will die. There is just no doubt about it. You will die. Now, one of the reasons I want to know if there's any law enforcement in the room is I've been in law enforcement now about 20 years. Unfortunately, one of the realities of law enforcement is bad things happen to good people. Sometimes people die. And I can tell you right now that if somebody is a heart patient and they die in their home, there is very little reason that anyone's going to investigate what kind of medication they were taking. No cop who goes to a sudden death, which is usually what happens in the United States, you have a sudden death call, the police officer arrives, the medical examiner arrives, they hear that the person is on heart medication and is a heart patient, they write it down as died of natural causes. Nobody is going to the medicine cabinet and seizing up the Plavix prescription. Nobody is taking that and then sending it for analysis to a lab. And as a prosecutor, I was a local prosecutor for about 8 years, and I used to deal with these calls because we had to sign off on them when the police arrived. We had to sign off on them that they weren't a homicide, basically, that they weren't a murder. And nobody is going to order, seize up all the medication in the house and look at it. And let's send it to the lab to see if it's counterfeit. So unfortunately, we don't know whether people are dying regularly from buying counterfeit medications, but we do know the sales of counterfeit Plavix, counterfeit Lipitor, and other medications that are literally life-saving are on the rise because of the distribution on the web. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the internet later. But let me just start out with telling you that law enforcement does not want to be the internet police. It is just not something we're interested in. Now, unfortunately, because of obviously the globalization of the world through the internet, all the positive things that the internet does, it has become a distribution mechanism for criminals. Criminals adapt just like anything else. They will always seize on a new technology. When I was a younger prosecutor, we used to charge people with crimes committed over the telephone. That shows you how old I am and how long I've been doing this. But the telephone was the primary vehicle for committing criminal activity. So the legislature developed a statute called wire fraud, where basically if you committed a crime over the telephone, we prosecuted for that. We had a statute, we still do, that was mail fraud, because of course when the mails were set up, people used to start committing crimes through the mail. And so we needed to punish them for that because we wanted to preserve the mail as a vehicle for commerce and legitimate communication. We wanted to preserve the telephone as a vehicle for commerce and legitimate communication. Law enforcement is the same way about the internet. We want people to feel safe on the internet. We want people to go to sites like this that are real and feel comfortable buying from them. We want people to feel, frankly, safe sitting in their living room in their pajamas if they want to, shopping. Because that's what we want as a society. We want commerce to thrive. So I'll talk about an operation called In Our Sights in a moment that is directed specifically to the internet. And one of the criticisms of that operation has been that we are trying to police the internet. We're trying to regulate the internet. We don't want to do that. It's actually just the opposite. We would like criminal activity off of the internet so that it can be safe and free and open for everyone without suspicion, without concern. Another area that we investigate, because the Customs Service also used to deal with the physical goods of child exploitation, child sexual abuse, which were movies and magazines and books back in the 70s and 80s, that has almost exclusively migrated to the internet. So as a law enforcement agency, we have also, our agents have migrated to the internet. So we do a lot of investigation of child exploitation on the internet. It doesn't mean, of course, that we're anti-internet. It means we're pro-children, quite frankly, and we want to preserve as much as we can of that vehicle for legitimate commerce and legitimate use. I think I have to move up here just for a moment to show you this, but the most mind-boggling thing for me as a law enforcement official about counterfeiting is how there's no conscience anymore within the criminal organizations that produce counterfeit goods. I don't really have as much of a problem if you stick with IZOD or other products to counterfeit. But when you start getting into, we seized about 2,000 airbags last fall, I believe it was. These 2,000 airbags were suspected of being counterfeit. We weren't absolutely sure. The United States runs a highway transportation safety agency, just like I'm sure Greece does. A lot of countries will. We sent them to that agency for testing. The agency said, we're not going to test all 2,000. So you do what you do in a scientific world. You take a sampling, random sampling. We took, I think, 10. We said, would you please test 10? All 10 were shown to be counterfeit. They sent us a video of their testing. You may have seen videos in the past of crash test dummies actually being slammed into a wall or something like that in a vehicle. They didn't crash the car. They have a way of actually just activating the airbag without ruining the car. There's no sound, just so you know. See, the first one doesn't really inflate at all. If the dummy's head actually had been going towards the steering wheel, it would not have been protected in any way. The second one, I'll show you after the highway transportation folks have a very brief public service announcement for themselves, and then you'll see it was last fall. Just explodes. You see that major part going towards the neck of the driver? They told us later that if it had been a real human being, it would have actually just gone through the person's neck. It went with such force that it would have just gone through them. This is, again, the reality of where we are with criminal organizations, is that the price point for an Izod shirt is not real high when you sell it in the Plaka, for instance. It gets produced for $5, let's say, €5. And they can sell it maybe for 20 euros, 30 euros, because when you're buying it out on the street, you know it's counterfeit. So you're not going to pay the 80 euros that an Izod shirt's normally going to cost you, or 100 euros. You know you're getting a counterfeit, so you want that discount. They've now recognized that they can make these products, airbags, which go into vehicles that have been in accidents and usually cost about $500 to $1,000, basically, US. And they can make them and sell them for $250 to $300 and get a huge profit margin out of that. And they don't care about the individual that's in the crash, as I'll show you in just a moment. All right, we'll try one more. The home safety equipment. Ultimately, what we're seeing now is, this was a fire extinguisher that had a phony Underwriters Laboratory sticker on it. You'll see it there. Underwriters Laboratory is a scientific testing facility. They will spend a significant amount of time testing products and then putting their seal of approval, if you will, on them because they work. This is a fire extinguisher. Makes the fire bigger. There is no product within that fire extinguisher that will extinguish a fire. By the way, if you ever have a fire you need to put out, just find a really big board, as you'll see the guy in a moment. Just throw it on that. That really works perfectly. Ultimately, again, I mean, we're going to have a fire in a residence, and they're going to use that extinguisher that they may have bought through clearly a legitimate supply chain store, and the house is going to burn down. The extinguisher is probably going to get completely destroyed, and the fire investigators are going to show up, and there's going to be no indication that there was a counterfeit fire extinguisher. We're just going to say it was a fire that just got out of control, as fires do. This is the new world of counterfeit organized crime. This is a circuit breaker factory. This is not what we like to look at in circuit breaker factories. We don't like individuals who are clearly not trained, who are clearly not certified, who are clearly not supervised, creating things that go into buildings that control electricity. We don't want that. Now, ultimately, this is a small production facility. I think we have 5 individuals there who will probably put out, you know, each one of those, it's hard to tell, but each one of those is about 10 circuit breakers. But this is what we find when we start to do our investigations. Each one of those boxes contains 50 circuit breakers. And each one of those boxes is now multiplied by about 200, 300 on that pallet, on that wooden container. And all of those are coming into the U.S., and all of them are going into buildings. They're going into our children's schools, they're going into our hospitals, they're going into our elderly health care facilities. And when one of those fails, again, we will have an investigation, of course, but the evidence will be destroyed. So we will not know that the cause of that fatal fire was a counterfeit good. So we're not talking about Izod shirts anymore, although, again, we do our enforcement because that's important, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But where we are now is a critical health and safety crisis, quite frankly. We are at a point where we now have to worry about every product that is in our supply chain. Those look legitimate to me just looking at the packaging. And ultimately, they're made, obviously, to look as legitimate as possible. Hits home for law enforcement. The U.S. Marshals, I think they have a TV show. Everyone has a TV show except my agency, by the way. But ultimately, the U.S. Marshals run a service, well, not a service, it's their function. They find criminals who are fugitives in the United States, and they bring them into courts. They're actually really good at it. By the way, if a criminal escapes from a prison, he either goes to his girlfriend's house or his mother's house. U.S. Marshal told me this one time. So they are really good at it, but they always just go to mom's house. He has a flashlight on, he has a firearm. On his firearm is a flashlight. He goes into very dark facilities. He wants that flashlight on his firearm because he doesn't want to have a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other hand. It's a lot easier when they're all together. And so he basically buys a battery to put into his flashlight that goes on his firearm. The battery is counterfeit. It's like most police officers, he has it on a holster on his hip. He had this shirt on, which basically, when the battery exploded, that's what it did to his shirt. He also got third-degree burns on his skin. Not terrible, but this explosive battery is right near what are explosive bullets. Certainly could have been a lot worse, fortunately for him. So this hits home now for us in terms of this is a government agent who is buying counterfeit goods. Now, he bought it through the legitimate supply chain, but this is ultimately where he's going. I talked to you about where criminal enforcement. Emily, would you just tell me when we need to break for the first part? I talked about criminal enforcement and criminal investigations and organized crime networks. This is an actual transcript from a recording in the U.S. of an investigation we did also in the Port of New Jersey area. And basically these two individuals are talking about their organization. And one says, well, everything should be of really good quality. He says, I don't really care. I just want to make money. He said, well, you should have a conscience. And he said, well, then go be a monk. They don't have consciences anymore. Okay? Now, for those of us in law enforcement, again, bad things happen to good people. We know that there's little conscience in criminal organizations. But now where they have gone is to the side of extreme profit over anything else. Oh, God, I got another video. All right, well, this actually is going to segue, so before I try to do that again, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why we do this beyond health and safety. And, you know, the Homeland Security Department, you would also not think is the Commerce Department. We're not the people who try to promote necessarily the economy of the United States. But I think, quite frankly, there is a link between the security of a country and its economy. I think we tend to see that in emerging democracies. We tend to see that in the Middle East, where we know that the economy of a country can be directly related to how people will react, obviously, to their leaders. And so we do protect the economy of our country in Homeland Security, just as probably a lot of departments in the United States do. And the areas that I've talked about obviously impact on trademark holders a lot. Trademark holders in the United States, somebody said earlier, are job creators. We are still, to a great extent, a manufacturing society in the United States. We have a large number of manufacturing facilities. We are obviously a retail society in that we employ people who will actually sell the goods. I think there's someone from Louis Vuitton here. Louis Vuitton is not an American company. It is a company that is pretty much primarily based in Europe and France. But it employs 20,000 Americans, including at a manufacturing facility in California. So we seize Louis Vuitton handbags or other items that LVMH owns, but it's not because we love our French colleagues and counterparts, but it's not because we want to help a French company. I'll be very candid about that. We want to protect the jobs in the United States. We don't want 20,000 Americans out of work. We already have enough Americans out of work. We would like them to keep working. And the sale of counterfeit goods impacts on those jobs, because when people will buy counterfeit goods, they're not going to buy a genuine article. Now, I know there's some discrepancies and arguments about that. Oh, they wouldn't have bought it anyhow because it's too expensive. As a law enforcement official, I don't get to make that choice. I don't get to make that determination. Policymakers have already decided that it's a criminal act when you use that trademark on a counterfeit good. I want to talk about, I'm just going to drink some water first, but I want to talk about piracy for a moment. Again, thinking counterfeit, trademarks, piracy, copyright. We do a lot of film piracy work in the United States. It is no secret that Hollywood is a major influencer of what we're trying to accomplish, because Hollywood creates jobs. Hollywood creates jobs not just in California, but throughout the United States and throughout the world. And I'll talk about that just in a moment. But when a movie is made, it spends a lot of money in the community that it's made in. So the reason that the city of New York has a movie office is because a lot of movies obviously are filmed in New York. And it creates a lot of jobs and revenue for the people who live there. So right away, they're job creators. But I think another point about Hollywood movies that's not well understood is that the people who work on the movies, the guy who holds the microphone, or the person who moves the camera from the shot that the director thought he wanted to the shot that he really wants now, those people don't get paid actually that much when they're working on the movie set. Their money comes later on when the movie actually sells, when DVDs are sold, or when now in digital environment, the movie is actually watched on the digital, on the computers, obviously, on the internet. Not only is their salary paid more on what they call sort of the back end or downstream revenue, as they call it in Hollywood, not only is that the way they make money, but it also actually pays for their pensions and it pays for their health care insurance. So if there is a bootleg DVD that's purchased, that person who held the microphone makes no money. That person's pension will not be paid. That person's health insurance premiums for him, her, and their family will not be paid. So there is an architecture that has been set up within this industry that is based on the sales all the way through over whatever it is, 6 months, 8 months that a movie is actually popular. And so we have an obligation as law enforcement to protect those individuals because they joined on thinking they were going to earn their money as it got sold. And it's not fair to them that somebody wants to save €5 on a product, so therefore they don't get paid or they don't get their health insurance premium paid. So ultimately, there is a reason why we spend time on film piracy as well. Software licenses. I don't enjoy spending €100. Is there anyone from Microsoft here? Good. I don't enjoy spending 100 euros, $100 on WordPerfect or whatever I have to pay Microsoft for. But if I don't do that, if I just bootleg it, the people that work for Microsoft don't get paid. Now, they're going to get a salary, I get that. But that's how Microsoft makes its money, is software licenses. And so it's not fair to the people that produce that product that I just simply don't want to pay for it. And as a law enforcement agency, we're frankly put in the middle of that to a great extent, because we have to enforce that copyright. I won't go through every one of them. We obviously know about music. We know about some of the areas of other areas of digital content, but it's important to understand how these go. Okay, now I get to struggle with this again and try to show you a little bit that I think emphasizes that, and I'll tell you why this is something that I even have. It's like your car.
Free movies! I got free movies!
What do you mean?
These same movies you see in the theater, I got them on DVD, and they're free.
Free.
Free?
Free! I'll be honest, they're illegally downloaded, but they're free.
Yeah, okay, I'll take them.
Can I take two?
Sure, you can take two, but there's a catch. If you take these movies, this nice woman right here loses her job.
Yeah, I don't know her.
No.
Yeah, these are illegally downloaded movies. And because of that, people like her are losing their jobs.
You're making this so literal. I mean, is this really?
Yeah, there's a consequence to all this stuff.
I'm gonna take them.
You are?
Yeah.
Why? Because you have no soul?
If I take this, she loses her job.
That's right. It's real.
I'm gonna just take three. Just three.
You're what's wrong with everything. What's more important, the movie or this human being?
Nah, no, thank you.
See, you're a nice person. She's a nice person. She just didn't know. Now you know. Look, whether you get it off the streets or off the internet, digital piracy and product counterfeiting are not victimless crimes. The financial repercussions are huge. Show the world that piracy doesn't work. Do it.
All right, so look, a lot of people think it was produced by industry. I'll tell you that right now. It's produced by NBC Universal. A lot of people think it's hyperbole, it's polemic, you know, it's somehow an exaggeration. I frankly probably would have thought that 5 years ago before I started doing a lot more investigation in this area, started doing a lot more work in this area. And I went to a movie set. I actually had the opportunity to go to the set of Transformers 3, I think it was. I kind of lose track. But ultimately I went because the director, a man named Michael Bay, is very heavily interested in movie piracy. Because he was walking down the streets, I think in Beijing or somewhere, and he saw his movies out on the street being sold illegally, and it just bothered him. I think that's a reasonable reaction. So we went to talk to him and got to sit on his movie set for a little bit. First of all, I saw 100, 150 people working, which is obviously, again, a huge impact for that community. But while we were on a little break, while they were setting up one of their shots, a guy actually came up to me who holds the mic boom. So, you know, I think this actually was produced around the same time or after, so he couldn't have seen it. And he actually came up to me and he started talking about when he goes with his son to the local store. He lives in Florida, but he works in California when he can. He said, I go with my son and I see the counterfeit DVDs right on the counter. And I know that that has an impact on what I can earn because I'm not going to make any money off of that. The person who held the mic boom is not going to make any money. And so it is obviously meant to be somewhat emotional, but it's accurate. And so what we did was we obtained this public service announcement from NBC Universal. And we actually use it, and you saw, as you see, we put our badge on it, and we put the IPR Center seal on it, and we started talking about the economic impact of counterfeiting and piracy on our website as well. So there's an economic consequence to this. Now, let me just move away from the United States for a moment, because I recognize that it is not the responsibility of the world to protect jobs in the United States. But we're now starting to work a lot with European movie theater owners on piracy, because European movie theater owners are the ones who are actually suffering the most from the digital camcording and theft of the audio that is going on in Europe. Not everybody wants to watch a movie in English. A lot of people would like to watch a movie in their own language. And so now a lot of the movies are being recorded by video camera in the theaters in Europe, and they are then, of course, being broadcast over the internet back to those European countries. The person who loses money there is the movie theater owner, because they're not going to the movie theaters. I'm going to show you a couple of movie pirate sites probably after the coffee break, but I will tell you that the sites that I have up, the shots, you won't recognize those movies because they're no longer in theaters. But when we took an enforcement action against those sites, every image that's on there of a movie was a movie in the theater at the time. So when the movie theater doesn't attract customers because of movie piracy, okay, a movie theater owner can probably afford to lose 7 or 8 euros. But when those tickets don't get sold, when the concessions don't get sold, when ultimately there's less people to go to the movie theater, everybody who works for that company starts to lose money and starts to lose a job. And so there is an impact of all of this. And it may seem as though, you know, whether Angelina Jolie makes another $1 million on her next movie is trivial. It probably is. I don't think Angelina Jolie is going to go hungry next year because of that. But the reality is that we're not doing this because of Angelina Jolie. We're doing this because of all those people who work down the line who this has been the way that they have made money in the past. And so ultimately, again, I think there's debate about whether the movie industry, the music industry, others need to change their business model. I don't get to make that choice or that decision. The law is set up to protect them right now, and ultimately that's why our investigations and our enforcement go that way. Now, I'm not here to publicize their activity. I think they are trying to recognize a different business model. But even if you think that's the right way to go, I'm not sure how that negates the right that they have to legal action and to enforcement of their copyright or enforcement of their trademark. All right. This is a huge, really long bar graph. So do we want to take a quick break and then get some caffeine before the bar graph? So ultimately, we can talk a little bit more after. I also really welcome questions, comments. Probably should have said that an hour ago. But ultimately, if you want to interject at any time, if you want to talk about my trip to Santorini on Sunday, I'm happy to do that as well. Okay, thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have about 60 minutes or so left in this first portion before nourishment comes, and then you ultimately have a much better speaker in the afternoon. So ultimately what I wanted to say is about this bar graph that's really, really boring is all it really shows you in some ways is a shift in the enforcement against counterfeiting. And this is just counterfeiting, not piracy right now. These are hard goods, trademark violations. A shift from the big cargo containers that come into the ports to the smaller DHL, FedEx parcels that come into the United States from, dare he say it, China. Yes, 90% roughly of all the counterfeit goods that come into the United States are sourced from China. About 80% are direct shipments, about 10% are transshipped through Hong Kong or somewhere else. Ultimately, when I talk to colleagues in customs in the EU, this is the exact same phenomenon they are seeing. A reduction in the shipments through large cargo containers, more and more one by one coming in through express consignment shipping. You know, in law enforcement, you look at something like that and your first thought is, why is that happening? And ultimately, it is happening because of this. It's not a bad thing, the internet. Once again, it is not a bad thing, but criminals will exploit it. And the reason that they will exploit it is because they can make more money. So we're back to Izod, right? We're back to Lacoste. You can make more money selling your Lacoste counterfeit on an internet site than you will in the placa. Why is that? Because consumers want a good bargain. It's just inherent in shopping that you want the best price. Natural human reaction. So ultimately, what you have is somebody who has figured out that if I start a site that has the word Lacoste in it and I sell my counterfeit Lacoste items on there, I will actually make twice as much money, maybe even 5 times as much money as I would have otherwise. So how am I going to get those delivered to the individual? I am going to ship them through express consignment. What does that mean for law enforcement, for customs? It means that the seizure of 40,000 of these items in a cargo container, in a 40-foot can as we call them, is less and less likely. And now you're trying to pick off DHL shipments or China Post or EMS or FedEx. Not possible. It's just not possible. We don't have enough customs agents in the United States or anywhere in the world to sit there and look at all the packages that are coming in, and we would shut down commerce if we did. There would be huge hue and cry throughout the United States that we were taking the time to look through every package. And there should be. It's not the way we can enforce. We just can't protect the American public that way by seizing all the packages that are coming through. Now, when you look at this, what I would suggest is that you look at it for what is being copied on there. Well, obviously the trademarks are being copied. Their little alligator is a trademark, and that is being copied. What else is being copied? The entire look of the website. The entire look of the website is comparable to what Lacoste's website will look like. It has the color schemes. It obviously has the images that you associate with Lacoste. People who are really cool and having fun hanging out on a moped. I'm pretty sure this is in Greece somewhere, and I think it's in Santorini, and I'm going to go find it. You know, I want to be this guy, right? So ultimately, this is what they're selling now. It's no longer the counterfeit image that we believe and we have in our minds of the guy selling it on the street corner. All right? Shame on me if I go to the guy on the street corner and pay 20 bucks, but I know that that's what I'm getting. But shame on them when they are now setting up a distribution system that relies on consumer fraud, that basically takes the consumer and says, you know what, if we make a website that has the look of the Timberland boot on it and is called realtimberland.com, we can sell those now for $83 per fake shoe rather than $20. My boss said to me, he said, real Timberland is neither real nor Timberland. And ultimately, how would I know? All right, I'm pretty cynical. I've been doing this a long time. My wife says there was a change one day. We've been married 20 years. She said there was a change in you one day where you don't trust human beings the way you used to. It's unfortunate, right? You know, I love all of you. But I mean, ultimately, it's the way that it is in law enforcement. We become cynical. But how would I be so cynical as to go on that site and say, oh, it can't be counterfeit? I just don't know. I just don't know why I would do that if I'm shopping for Timberland. So now we're not just talking about an economics issue. We're not just talking about protecting the Timberland company, which is based in Maine, which is a really nice state in the United States, and ultimately employs thousands of people. All right, so everything that they make is made in the United States. They employ everybody there, and so it is important to protect them. But it is also important to protect the consumers who are going to realtimberland.com and thinking they're getting the actual item. Now, I love to play this with audiences. This is called Real or Fake. Okay, these are two websites. One of them is the real Rosetta Stone website. One of them is the fake Rosetta website. Everybody has to raise their hand for one. Let's just start with that principle, okay? Who thinks the one on the left is the real one? Okay, I got about 5. Who thinks the one on the right is the real one? All right, some of you did not vote. I know that. Those of you who went with the right are correct. Those of you who went with the left just bought a phony product. You went on the web because you want to learn a new language. Rosetta Stone was started by a professor of languages who thought that he could come up with a better way to teach languages than had been done in the past. He came up with an innovative system. There's that word innovation, right? He came up with something that was new. He developed it, I think it's like a classic success story. In his basement or his garage, he developed it with like 5 people. He now employs hundreds of people in the United States, in Virginia, which is the state that I still own a home in. And ultimately, he developed this product and started to put it out there. And he's successful now. Granted, he probably lives in a much bigger house than he had when he started it. But everything he makes is made in the United States with the exception of a few products. And when they buy the real Rosetta Stone, that's what they're getting. When they buy the fake Rosetta Stone, and this was a story on the news, this father bought it for his daughter who was traveling overseas. She got CDs, DVDs that didn't work, right? Here, enjoy your language class. It doesn't work. So ultimately, it's a consumer fraud for him. I have a 14-year-old son. 14-year-old sons like toys. He wanted Beats by Dre headphones. I am cynical. I go on the web. I try to buy him Beats by Dre headphones. Hands for the left side being the fake one. Okay, oh, sorry, real one. Let's stay with it. Left side being the real one. Right side being the real one. I love that the fake one is called Original Beats by Dre, right? I mean, because if I'm going to fool you, I might as well go all out. I might as well be the guy who gets you to spend, you know how much Beats by Dre costs, by the way? Ultimately, I didn't buy the Beats by Dre not because of this, but because he moved on. He decided he didn't want them. And I went, yeah. So ultimately, this is where we are. This is where the consumer is, the person who is sitting there trying to buy something on the internet, which again, we want to be a legitimate vehicle for commerce. We want people to shop that way. It is encouraging to our economies when they spend money. And ultimately, we want them to feel safe doing it. All right, last one. I could do these all day, but ultimately, last one, you want to buy the engagement ring for your fiancé, the one item in life that you should probably get right. Where do you go? Where do you go if you want that Tiffany blue bag image, right? Just quick, left, right, left, right. Okay, so right is the real. All right. You're going to stay married. I don't know. I don't know how we can ask people to tell. I told you one was fake or one was real. They don't get that clue when they go on and they do a search engine. I won't even say a name of a search engine, but a search engine that starts with G and ends with E. They don't know. Nobody has told them that these criminal networks don't care about them at all. Nobody has told them that there are people who just want to take their money and sell them fake products. I don't have them because I just only have a little amount of time, but what about the medicine sites? Every one of them looks like this. Every one of them is meant to look as real and genuine as possible. Every one of them is meant to instill confidence that you're going to live if you take that medicine. Let's go to movie piracy, okay? Somebody asked me, and I'm just going to feed the question now. Somebody asked me if people realize when they download movies that they're committing a crime. They might. I think most of them probably do understand that it's not the right way to do it. Do they think it's criminal? Do they think people are being hurt by it? Probably not. I don't think the average human being wants to hurt someone. I think we all want to try to live nicely, but it's a lot easier. But when you go to a site that's called Watch Movies, and it has the same type of images, the same posters that you see in the movie theater, the same individual names on them, it doesn't say it's a copyright violation. Now, some of them do. I'll be candid. Some of the sites will say that. They'll say CAM on them, C-A-M, because they were camcorded. Some of them will say really good cam, you know, so you know that it's a really good one, as opposed to the one that just goes shaky, you know. Ultimately, though, this is movielinks.tv. I don't see how it's that much different than Netflix, if you have Netflix, or if you have a version. I don't see how it's that much different. You start to be conditioned to look for these things on these sites. And that's what the trademark owners and those that run this, the real sites want. They want you to be conditioned to see that. So obviously the criminals copy it, and they look like that site. Movielinks.tv was the 256th most popular website in the United States in June of 2010. This is an unofficial ranking because there isn't a ranking of websites that is official. But there is a company called Alexa.com that does a fairly good job trying to evaluate what a popularity is of a website, because people that run websites actually want to know that. They want to know who's coming to their website, they want to know where they're coming from, they want to try to build a better website for people, so they rely on that information. So we do too in law enforcement, and we look at that, and it's the 256th most popular website in the United States. My agency's website is in the 6,000 range. We would love to have the 256th most popular website in the United States. We're not going to. Movielinks.tv had 3 million unique visitors in June of 2010. 3 million unique visitors. Again, for companies that run legitimate websites, the monetization of that is huge. If you get 3 million people visiting your website, you're making buckets of money. So were those guys, criminally. They were taking what are camcorded movies, illegally copied movies from DVDs, mostly camcorded because, as I said, these were all in the theaters at the time. They are putting them together with audio that they usually get from another source, especially, again, if it's in different languages. And they were putting them out on a site that was making them probably a couple of $100,000 a month for doing nothing to produce jobs, to produce tax revenue, for producing anything for the economy. All of it is pure theft, and they're turning it into pure criminal profit. So ultimately, what is going on with movielinks.tv is it's popular. Now, a lot of people say, well, it's popular because people don't want to pay 7 or 8 euros to go to the movies. I get that. I don't really want to do that. But the fact of the matter is again, we have the criminal laws to protect the people that put $100 million into the movie. And ultimately, that's the investment that we think is worth protecting, is that innovation and that development. I'll just show you a quick picture from ZML.com because I think, again, this is not a fly-by-night operation. This is not an operation that looks so unprofessional that if I go there and I decide to go watch Iron Man 2, which I think there's already a 3 by now, but this again is June 2010, and I'll tell you why that's important in a moment. I don't know that it's not a smooth, good-looking site that I'm going to go watch movies on. And maybe I know it's wrong, maybe I don't care, but ultimately ZML is making the money, not the companies that produced it. The last one I'll show you quickly is TV Shack. TV Shack is a site that in June 2010 was earning the young man who ran it probably about $250,000 annually, dollars. He gets his funding in part from advertisements. I doubt that the Progresso company knows that necessarily they're funding a piracy site or that they would agree to that. But the way that the ad networks are set up, it's not decided that way. That's not what the decision is. The decision is based on his visitor count. He gets visitors, Progresso wants to sell soup, seems like a perfect match. Ultimately, it doesn't work that way, unfortunately, for these people who are called the content providers, NBC, BBC. I don't know what M is. Ultimately, they got nothing. They got nothing from Progresso. They get nothing from the owner of TV Shack, who put all of the most popular TV shows and movies on his website. What does that person look like? He looks like that. These are not hardened criminals. I don't want anyone to believe that I'm talking about the same situation of the guys who counterfeit the airbags here. These are guys like this, okay? This guy lived in a dorm room in the UK. He's very talented at what he does, which is put together websites and figure out how to bring together the things that he needs to make that website work. Smart kid. I think he might have been 20 or 21 years old at the time that the City of London police basically went and arrested him. Now, he's such a smart kid that I really wish he would have found a different way to make a living on the internet. There have got to be dozens of ways to make money on the internet that will not result in the City of London police arriving at your home at 6 a.m. to arrest you. And I'm sure he's so smart he could have figured that out. But he chose not to. As I said, he made, I'll convert it real quickly, probably about 220,000 euros, we believe, in 18 months. In 18 months, 220,000 euros. He bought a really nice Mini Cooper. He laundered a lot of the money through his mother's bank account. He, with his mother's knowledge, by the way, he had a pretty good life. When the government, the United States government, sought to take a lot of that money away, he said he took a lot of his friends out to dinner. So he was a popular guy. Now he is pretty much branded a criminal for the rest of his life, because he came into our sights, if you will, when we started a program called Operation Our Sights, a law enforcement action. Sights, by the way, is purposely misspelled. We spend a lot of time in law enforcement trying to come up with cool law enforcement operation names. And Operation Our Sights was intended to be what it says, which is basically taking aim to stop the sale of counterfeit and pirated items. A sustained effort to combat that express consignment shift. Because we cannot be at every mail sorting facility in the United States looking at every package, we had to take the enforcement backwards to the sites themselves and start to go at the operators of those sites, start to go to whatever we could take and seize and disrupt to keep them from the criminal activity of selling counterfeit goods, of defrauding the consumers, of stealing the copyrighted material, of obviously endangering the health and safety of individuals. And that's not meant to be a complete list of the pharmaceuticals, music, movies, etc., but that was the things that we were tending to see. We can do this for a couple of reasons. I mentioned the copyright and trademark laws, the federal statutes we have. They also have a confiscation statute part to them. So it says when you're engaged in copyright violations and trademark violations, you have to give the government certain things through the court that you earned, for instance. If it's criminal proceeds, we're going to take it from you. If it's the items that you bought or used in your criminal activity, we're going to take that from you as well. So we started to proceed with the same way any law enforcement investigation works. We looked at the sites, we bought a lot of the products, we spent a fair amount of money on counterfeit goods. We don't enjoy doing that, but we did that to make sure that they were counterfeit goods. We bought them. If it was a Louis Vuitton product, we brought the Louis Vuitton representative in or showed him photos of it. He told us it was fake. Nike, the same thing. Any of those items, we worked with the rights holders to make sure that they were fake. We also did it with the copyright violations, obviously the pirated material. So for instance, when you saw movielinks.tv, in June of 2010, once we put it through that investigation and went to the court and showed our investigation to the court, to the judge, we obtained an order to seize it. We obtained an order to seize the website and instead put up that seizure banner instead of the pirated movies. So on June 11th, 2010, when you went to look at movielinks.tv, you saw something that looked like that banner. It's evolved over the few years, but it basically looks similar to that. So the domain name was, you heard, .tv. When the internet was set up, somewhat by a fluke, I think, just more organizational than anything else, the United States had jurisdiction over .com, .net, .org, .tv. There's a number of other ones. And ultimately, federal courts had jurisdiction over those. So when we looked at these sites and we said, okay, that's a site that's engaged in criminal activity. We've bought 3 counterfeit goods from it over the last 6 weeks. We've looked at these movies, the software, the music, whatever it is. We were able to go to the court and say, that's a criminal activity, and that site is being used for criminal activity. Or that site is been purchased. Even though a .com domain name costs about maybe €5, it still was purchased with some money. And ultimately, our argument was it was purchased with illicit proceeds or what they call substitute proceeds. So we look at that and we think, okay, we've now achieved the seizure of the site. What we didn't realize was how many people would be interested in this. So when we put up these seizure notices on the site, and instead of seeing the pirated movies or the counterfeit goods, you now saw this, we also publicly released a list of the sites that we seized. More people started going to some of the sites just to look at the seizure banner than had previously gone to look at the site before. So we now had 120 million hits over the 3.5 years that we've run this program. 120 million hits. That's monetization, by the way, if you can look at trying to get 120 million people to something that you're putting out. We also have made 15 arrests. We've arrested individuals like that young man that you saw previously who ran TV Shack, a number of people in the United States, and Edward will talk about that in a little bit more in detail. We've also seized $3 million US in assets, because when you do sell counterfeit goods, that money has to go somewhere. A lot of it happened to go to the Bank of China, which has a Manhattan, New York office. So we had an agent walk into the Bank of China one day with a court order to seize $900,000 from the Bank of China. We have seized PayPal accounts. We have seized commercial accounts. We have worked with credit card companies and payment processors to shut down the ability to actually fund these sites. We've tried to work with the ad brokers as well to talk about you shouldn't have ads on these sites. And they've started to come up with, I think, some voluntary guidelines at least to make that happen. The public service announcement you saw before of the individual who was offering the free DVDs on the streets of New York, we actually put that on the seized sites. So it says here, for more information on IP theft, please click on this banner. If you clicked on that banner, you went to the public service announcement that you saw, and that played for you. Because we thought, well, we have 100 million people looking at these sites. We might as well try to do something with that opportunity. That video has now been seen 350,000 times. The banner itself has language on here about obviously illegal conduct. I just want to let you know, we're not naive. We're not thinking that the mere presence of a banner or statements of this is illegal or a public service announcement is going to eliminate counterfeiting and piracy. But what if it reduced it by 1%, just 1% of the 120 million people? That's not a bad day's work for a law enforcement agency in terms of trying to communicate a message of responsibility and actually good citizenship. So that's what we did. Let me just show you what happened on June, I think I said June 2010, I'm sorry, June 30th of 2010 was the date of the first in our sites. We worked with various countries, the Netherlands. We worked throughout the United States. We went to a lot of houses of individuals who were running sites to actually look at, to actually just talk to them, some to arrest them. We seized a lot of servers. We actually went very aggressively against the counterfeiting and piracy on the internet because that was our intention at the time. One of the sites was called Ninja Video that was seized on that day. We executed, as it says, 4 search warrants at houses. We seized their PayPal account, and we ultimately, working with the Justice Department, indicted them. We indicted a number of them, including this woman, who was fairly bold in her activities of pirating. She used to go on the internet and post sort of how-tos of what they're doing. She was a moderator of their chat forums and ultimately had no compunction about putting her image out there regularly. She went to prison for almost 2 years based on her criminal activity. She had earned probably hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of her time. These are the individuals who do this. This individual lives in Greece. She was also a part of Ninja Video. She made, not much, she made about $30,000 US. She has been indicted by a federal court in the United States. She has a federal criminal charge against her. For $30,000, she now has a federal criminal charge against her. She also has what's called an Interpol Red Notice against her, which for anyone who understands what that means, it's going to restrict her travel throughout the world. If she decides to go to another country, she can very well be detained in that country for a period of time. At the very minimum, she's going to find her stay at the airport much longer than she probably anticipated. For $30,000 for the rest of her life, that will exist. So this is the message that we're trying to convey. This is the message that we're trying to get across to people in terms of deterrence and in terms of what we're talking about for the long term. I just want to try to go through these a little bit quickly, but when we seized the domain names, for instance, of some of these sites, a lot of people told us it wouldn't be effective, it wouldn't work. They're just going to come up the next day, and they're just going to be more sites after that and after that. We didn't know, quite frankly. I don't know how it is in Athens, but in Washington, there's a lot of people who will tell you you're going to fail at something. So we understood that we might have failed. But what we found was interesting. Again, working through the Alexa rankings and working through what's called Google Analytics, we're able to develop a model. Some of the sites did come back. So this is what MovieLinks TV tried to start. And you can see, it's kind of hard to understand, I'll just tell you briefly, the traffic fell to almost nothing. So where they were having 3 million unique visitors, they now had a very, very small fraction of that. And ultimately, they never succeeded. Because what we did by taking away their domain name, just one moment, I'll get you. What we succeeded by taking away their domain name was we took away their identity. That's their brand name. And that's how people knew how to get to them. And so it was successful. And we had the Motion Picture Association of America come and tell us that after we seized just 9 of them, 9 of what they thought were the worst of the worst piracy sites, 81 other domain names, websites, voluntarily stopped offering illegal material. 81 others. So we had an impact on 90 total, even though we only took law enforcement action against 10% of that number. Now, as I mentioned, I can be cynical after being in law enforcement for a while, but I will tell you, we never see that level of general deterrence in criminal enforcement. If you go against a drug house in a raid and you shut down that drug house, the drug house that's down the street does not put itself out of business. Actually, business gets better. And so it's unfortunately the part of our lives that we tend to do it often. But that type of enforcement is very good. And I'll get to your question just in a moment. But This was one of the sites, the 81 that went down. And it may be hard to read. It just says, we were approached by the US government. And so we've just decided to shut down. Now, the shutdown part was truthful. The part about being approached by the US government was not. Okay, there's a little bit of machismo, I guess, if you want, in this. They don't want to admit that they're just scared. They want to just say, hey, you know, US government's looking at us, we're that important. That didn't happen. But I don't care. Frankly, I think for us, it's great when they decide to do that. Did you want to ask a quick question? I'm just going to drink water and then I'm going to answer. It's quite possible. I don't know. I will tell you that right now there's a study by one of the studios that piracy is on the increase. The use of pirated material or the viewing of pirate material is on the increase. It's growing. I guess I have to explain it to you from a law enforcement standpoint. I have to hit the criminals and hurt them as much as possible. The way to do that is to lock them up, obviously, to take away their proceeds, and to disrupt their criminal profit. So what we did was we disrupted that person's criminal profit. But what we also found was that 81 others decided it was not an appropriate business to be in because of that enforcement. So I cannot tell you that the overall rates of movie piracy are reduced in the world. What I can tell you is we've had an impact in trying to get certain individuals to move into other lines of work. One thing I should mention is that about a dozen of those 81 sites started to channel to legitimate sources of content delivery, like Netflix, like Hulu, which is set up in the United States. And so now when you went on those sites, they had a little chat board about how much we like movies, and if you'd like to watch movies, click here, and you went to Netflix or Hulu. That, again, to us is a deterrent value. But I think, frankly, I'll just be very clear about this. Law enforcement is not the only solution. It's part of a broad-based solution that we have to come up with, but I think it's an impact that we've had. Just real quickly, just to show you one other, because this was very, very highly touted. After June, we did it again. In November, we went back and we went against more of these piracy domains, and that was torrentfinder.com. He came back the next day, as was predicted by some of our critics, and started torrentfinder.info. He never built up the traffic. It's hard to understand that box, I'm sorry, but he had basically about 1,000th of what he had before. He couldn't build back up his funding. One of the issues that we deal with is the transnational nature. I'll just put up the slide, I guess, and then talk about it. I'm sorry, I'll get back to him real quickly, just because in November, we had to then arrest him. So in June, we took down his first site of tvshack.net, I think it was. He did not follow the example of the 81 others. He set up a new site called tvshack. I think it was tvshack.tv, thinking that we did not have jurisdiction in the United States. He didn't check, we do. And so not only did we seize his site, but we charged him criminally in the Federal District Court in New York. This is called escalation of enforcement, and we escalated because he didn't, frankly, get the message the first time. So ultimately, that's why he finds himself now with these criminal issues that he's had to deal with. I think he's currently on probation to the Federal District Court in New York. He has given back, I forget, Edward, but probably $100,000 or something that he pledged to pay back because he decided to try to do it again. Okay, real quickly. It is a transnational issue. As I mentioned, the goods are produced in China. They are shipped into the United States. They are shipped into Europe, obviously. They are shipped into a lot of countries, and the money tends to go back through various countries to China or other places. Within the counterfeit fake medicines, it tends to be run by Russian organized crime or Israeli organized crime, again, being shipped into the United States, shipped into other countries, and then the money flowing back. Transnational crime requires a transnational solution, point blank. So ultimately, we worked with Europol in 2012, last year. Fortunately, because I'm now based in Brussels, I spend a fair amount of time at Europol, which is only a couple of hour drive away. And I worked with my colleague there to develop a transnational solution. So we now have, within Operation in Our Sights, we have 4 to 5 EU countries participating with Europol as the umbrella for that, and the IPR Center as the umbrella for my agency in the United States. And we've had an impact now globally. So ultimately, where we were one country doing this, we are now 5. We've run this twice, in November of 2012 and again in June of 2013, 2 enforcement actions. And ultimately, what we've tried to do is show that this is now a community of law enforcement. This is now a global community of law enforcement that will pay attention to counterfeiting and piracy on the internet. Because if we simply stay within our own jurisdictions, the criminals will adapt. So I told you about the jurisdiction over .coms, for instance. It didn't take the criminals very long to figure out that they just wouldn't register their counterfeit and pirated websites under .coms. They would register them under .eu, for instance, or .gr, or I can go through all of the .eu top, the EU top level domain names, but you all know them. And you know that there are sites out there, if you pay attention to this, you know that there are sites out there with that domain extension attached to it. Because again, when you're going after the consumer, you want him or her to feel comfortable. And I feel comfortable shopping with a .be because it's a Belgian company. Why shouldn't I feel comfortable? Even though it's not a Belgian company. It's a Chinese company, a company of criminals. So ultimately, it is now going to be part of our enforcement that we include Europol. Because this is a public forum, I won't talk about operational issues, but I think we'll grow that. I think this will grow and continue. Because ultimately it has to come up with a transnational criminal enforcement against, as I say, obviously what's just transnational crime. I think I have, how much, a little bit? I'm just going to take some questions then and then pass it on to Edward because I don't want to stop anyone from talking. I hope this has been helpful in terms of what we're trying to do, in terms of why we do it, in terms of ultimately where we think things are going. But as I said just about 5 minutes ago, we are not the solution of the problem. Customs enforcement, law enforcement is not the solution in and of itself. We play a role, and we hopefully are trying to step up to our role, but I think it's part of something bigger that we need to obviously work on together.